Hi, folks. Welcome back to Kitchen Table Politics. I'm your host, Jeremy Massengale, and we have a great show today discussing adoption and foster care. Before we get to our guest, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about my feelings on the pro-life movement and life in general. Yesterday, thousands of people marched on Washington, D.C. to show their feelings about life, and I think it's important to show a little solidarity with that group and discuss my own personal feelings. You know, often pro-life supporters are accused of being pro-birth and not actually pro-life. That doesn't describe me at all. I believe that life starts at conception, but it ends at natural death. Circumstances do not determine the value of human life. A child in the womb, a killer on death row, or a homeless person on the street, they all have the same value. We're all human beings. That doesn't mean that we don't face consequences for our actions, such as the killer on death row. But I think to lose a life is tragic no matter what. I think it's a more just punishment to have a life in prison sentence. A dear friend of mine recently said, when a life is taken, a world is destroyed, because no other human being will ever perceive the universe as that person did. And I think that's true. Just imagine what our world would be like if life was valued more than anything else. What if we created monuments to hold the names of every person that ever died? Not because they died in battle, not because they died in some heroic event, just simply because their life was so important that we all took a moment just to think about that person, if we knew them or not. Can you imagine how that would change the mindset of the world if life was so important that even the death of one single person brought a halt to all activity in a town? Is that an impossible goal? Well, maybe. But every inch closer to that goal would be a monumental achievement for the human race. In the first episode of this podcast, I started a segment called the Republican Report Card. I think it's important that we keep an eye on our elected officials. You know, just because they say something on the campaign trail or right before an election does not mean that they'll stick to it. And I think it's extremely important that we keep an eye on them and hold their feet to the fire to see if they actually do what they said they're going to do. Because of the March for Life that's going on right now, I've decided to look at that aspect of the Republican platform. And actually, the Republicans have been very busy in the last few days and weeks on this subject. So I thought it would be important to look at that. So I'm going to focus on that aspect today. Let me read from their platform. American taxpayers should not be forced to fund abortion. As Democrats abandon this 4-decade-old bipartisan consensus, we call for codification of the Hyde Amendment and its application across the government, including Obamacare. We call for a permanent ban on federal funding and subsidies for abortion and health care plans that include abortion coverage. Now, there's several bills passed over the last few days and an executive order dealing with the subject of abortion. The first thing I want to look at is the executive order signed by President Trump this past week. This order enacted the Mexico City policy. Let me read that for you. The Mexico City policy prohibits non-governmental organizations that receive U.S. funds, including International Planned Parenthood, from providing or promoting abortions as a method of family planning overseas. This policy also bans these organizations from advocating for the passage of pro-abortion laws in other countries. Besides the executive order, there was also a couple of bills that went before Congress. These bills actually passed the House. The first bill is H.R. 7. This bill actually makes the Hyde Amendment permanent. So that's right out of the Republican platform. You know, what the Hyde Amendment does is it bans federal funds for being used for any abortions. The second bill that passed the House was H.R. 315. This was called Improving Access to Maternity Care. Let me read that bill for you. This bill amends the Public Health Service Act to require the Health Resources and Services Administration to identify maternity care health professional target areas, which are areas within health professional shortage areas. that have a shortage of maternity care health professionals for the purposes of assigning maternity care health professionals to those areas. HRSA must collect and publish data comparing the availability of need for maternity care health services in health professional shortage areas and areas within those areas. I really think that bill was created to alleviate some of the concerns surrounding the defunding of Planned Parenthood. Democrats and Republicans can work together to ensure that the poorer women of this nation has the care that they need. There's one other bill that I want to bring to your attention. This bill has not gone through the House yet. It's just in the Judiciary Committee right now. But this one is H.R. 586. It's called the Sanctity of Human Life Act. Let me read that one to you. This one is huge. This bill declares that the right to life guaranteed by the Constitution is vested in each human and is a person's most fundamental right. Each human life begins with fertilization, cloning, or its equivalent, at which time every human has all the legal and constitutional attributes and privileges of personhood. And Congress, each state, the District of Columbia, and each U.S. territory have the authority to protect all human life. Senator Rand Paul actually announced yesterday that he is planning to introduce a similar bill in the Senate very soon. I do believe the Republicans actually stuck to their platform on this issue. Even though these bills haven't passed through the Senate yet, I'm going to give the Republican Party an A+ for sticking to their platform this week. I'll keep an eye on them. If they don't go through the Senate and they're not signed by the president, we may have to downgrade that grade. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll have a great discussion on adoption and foster care. This episode is brought to you by Amazon.com. Do you like shopping online and supporting political dialogue? Well, Kitchen Table Politics and Amazon.com has partnered up so that you can do both at the same time with no additional cost to you. Here's how it works. Go to ktpolitics.com and click on the Amazon tab. Then shop on Amazon just like you intended. Amazon will give the show a small portion of the proceeds. It's that simple. Again, it doesn't cost you anything extra, so you are supporting the show just by shopping as you normally would. Now please enjoy the rest of the show. With us today is Kelsey Debacker. She has been gracious enough to come and talk to us a little bit about a subject that's important, I think. In our present political climate, we talk about pro-life, pro-choice quite a bit, but I never hear anyone talk about the other side of that, which is foster care and adoption, which is really, really important to this whole process. Kelsey, thank you for being with us.
Oh, no problem. Glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your background and what you do now as far as foster care adoption goes.
Okay. Well, I work with an organization called Camelot Care Centers. They do a variety of different things, but my job is to be a therapeutic caseworker for foster care children who have a little bit more special needs than just the average foster care child. So the kids that get referred to me are kids that have been traumatized, have behavioral issues, sometimes physical or medical issues, emotional issues, things like that. Basically, I provide in-home support for the foster families once a week, and I help with things like getting them to their appointments for therapy or doctor's appointments or dental appointments, things like that. And I also coordinate with the schools and help make sure that the transition from, because foster care kids move from schools a lot and sometimes their academic stuff suffers. So I also help with that area as well.
Okay. I recently saw you post about a young lady that you had given a ride. I believe it was on a Thanksgiving. Was that right that you had talked about that?
Yes.
Could you tell us that story?
Well, that was actually from, I worked at a place called Youth Villages then. And what I was doing was I was taking a child from a residential group home, which is where we send kids who can't seem to stick anywhere, usually because of a behavioral issue. So they go to a group home once a bunch of foster homes have kicked them out, essentially. So she was lucky enough to find a foster home that was willing to take her for Thanksgiving. And she was I had to drive her from Nashville to Cleveland, so it's kind of a long drive. And almost the whole drive was taken up with her talking about how anxious she was. She hoped that the new foster family liked her because basically she wanted them to make the decision to adopt her in the short 2 days that she was going to be there, 2 to 4 days. I don't remember exactly how long, because she really wanted to be in a home by the time Christmas rolled around. She didn't want to be in the group home when Christmas rolled around. So I wasn't the caseworker for this girl. I was just helping with transportation. So I don't know what her specific behavioral issues were. But during the time that I spent with her, it struck me that it didn't really matter what they were because she was a child and she's entitled to unconditional love from parental figures. And for whatever reason, her parents just couldn't cut it as parents. And that left her in a position of being one of several children who don't have parents and who are stuck in group homes for the holidays.
Right. It's so sad. These kids that are in these homes, do you find that a lot of them do have emotional problems?
I would say not a single one doesn't have emotional problems. Just the very fact that they are in custody rather than with their parents. There's usually been neglect or abuse in their homes, but even if there wasn't, like the fact that they were taken from their homes is traumatic. And even the kids that were neglected or abused, and you would be like, well, of course they'd be happy to get out of there because their parents were terrible. That's not the case. They love their parents. No matter what their parents have done, they've won the unconditional love of their children, and their children are traumatized by their separation from them, even if they're healthier and happier in the foster home or the group home.
Right. I can understand that. What do you find is the toughest thing for that child to adjust to when they do go into a new home?
It can obviously vary depending on what occurred, but the biggest struggle I see is attachment. Usually there is a time of like pushing the boundaries of their foster family. Like they can be really angry that they're not with their family, their biological family anymore. So there's a lot of things that it's really hard for foster parents to interpret, like running away. I had a kid who ran away from his foster home the other day, and the foster father called me and he's like, that's the one thing I won't put up with. I won't put up with somebody not wanting to be here. I don't want to make him be here if he doesn't want to be here.
Yeah.
Well, that kid probably did want to be there. That's not why he ran. He didn't run away because he wanted to get away. It was a coping mechanism for him to run away. And it was more like he was trying to run to his old home than away from his current home. I mean, it's just like a lot of us as adults, when somebody hurts us and we really care about them, we want to be with them, sometimes we'll shut them out. Or we'll run away almost to see if they'll pursue us, to see if they'll come and try to get us. Basically, what these kids are doing when they push their foster parents away is they're trying to see if they can get that unconditional love from them. They don't know that. They're not cognizant of trying to do that, but that is what they're trying to do.
We focused just a little bit in the last few minutes about some negative things that you come across, but what are some positive things that you see happening in these foster homes for these kids?
Almost all of them improve in terms of school performance, legal involvement, health. You wouldn't even imagine seeing how these kids eat. For example, almost 100% of these foster kids, when they come into a foster home, the foster parents report that they've never seen a child eat so much. Like they just shovel their face with food. They hide food. They hoard it because they weren't sure when their next meal was going to be where they were before. So like we definitely see drastic improvement in physical health, and in mental health we do too, because usually when they enter into foster care, they're getting counseling, they're getting medical help, like in terms of psychotropics or whatever, that kind of medicine if they need that. And people care about their school performance for the first time, things like that. So they often will have nightmares and be sad and miss their parents, but everything else on the checklist seems to be much improved from entering foster care, just because they're getting consistent care every day.
Right.
Because most of them are suffering from neglect when they first come in. So I love the foster care system. Someone asked me the other day what I thought about the foster care system as opposed to having orphanages.
Mm-hmm.
The foster care system puts them into a family, so it's much more, there's a bigger caretaker to child ratio. So they're getting more individualized attention. And also they're in a more normal setting. They're in a family setting. The kids at their school, none of them live in a group home. None of them live in a dorm or anything like. They live with parents.
Right.
So it helps normalize their situation as much as possible. And that's another positive thing I think about the foster care system.
What are the requirements to become a foster parent?
Well, there are lots of different agencies you can go through. The first and least rigorous is DCS, the Department of Child Services. You have to go through what's called PATH classes, and it's about 7 weeks of classes. They usually take place on a Saturday. You learn things from CPR to medication management to how to be a therapeutic home, things like that. And you'd have to go through a home study where they would check out to make sure that you had things like running water, if you had guns, that they were kept safely and locked up and things like that. And just basically vetting you to make sure you're not just as bad as where they came from. If you go through a private agency like where I work, you still have to go through that same class, but they give you a little extra training on things like trauma. Because DCS uses agencies like mine for kids that have more needs.
Okay.
And then I think the whole process takes about 2 months to get certified. And then you get your first placement whenever a placement becomes available.
Right.
I guess. And you go from there, really. And we're getting new kids all the time. So if you get certified as a foster parent, it probably won't be very long until you get a child in your house.
Right. I think I saw online that there was almost 500,000 kids in the foster care system across the country, which is a large amount of kids. And then if things go the way that our leaders are talking now, there's a possibility that our Supreme Court will change a lot in the next 3 years, even to the point to where Roe versus Wade may be even overturned, which right now, I believe there's a million children that are aborted in the United States. That's a million children that possibly could go into the system that's already flooded with kids. So it's important for us to talk about what are we going to do with these children? How are we going to increase funding for programs like the one that you're involved in now and all of the programs across the country that these kids are involved in? What's the outlook in your agency right now? Are they even discussing things like that yet, or is it?
The thing that's being discussed the most right now is less about things like the influx of children from possibly banning abortion and more about Obamacare.
Okay.
Because Obamacare provided a lot of things for foster children that are now in jeopardy. For example, foster children are on Medicare. In Tennessee, that's TennCare. Used to be before Obamacare, when they turned 18, they'd just be kicked off.
Right.
They now have an extension till they're 26. Just like your children could stay on your health insurance until they're 26. That's something that we in foster care really value because these children usually don't have the skills they need to live on their own, to get insurance, to get a job if they're aging out of the foster care system.
Right.
And just in general, Obamacare did a lot of things to extend Medicare. So, I mean, that's the thing we're talking about the most. And 100% of our clients are covered by Medicare.
Right.
That's where we get paid from is TennCare, basically. So that's the thing that will most immediately affect us, I think.
Okay. I've heard, just watching the news, that sort of thing, that is actually part of what they're wanting to keep, maybe, is that ability to keep your kids on until they're 26, even if Obamacare gets repealed. Hopefully that's something that will stay.
I hope so.
And these kids will be able to stay in that program.
I definitely hope so. I
can't imagine being in that situation where they turn 18 and they've not had a stable home life, one way or the other, either if they're in an orphanage or if they're bouncing around in foster care. Is that something that happens a lot, that they bounce around, or is...
Yes, unfortunately. Yeah. Unfortunately. We try to keep kids in the same home as long as possible. So foster care is... Most of these kids, their parents aren't dead. Their parents messed up.
Right.
So the goal, if it's possible, is to get help for the parents as well and get them to the point where they can take their kids back. usually that process, we give them about a year to make substantial progress. And if they haven't made enough progress within a year, we go through what's called a TPR, or termination of parental rights. These kids are left not really knowing where they're going to end up for at least a year. Once their parents' rights have been terminated, then we start looking for a pre-adoptive placement. So if their current foster home is not pre-adoptive, we look for a place to move them. Unfortunately, sometimes people get cold feet. Like I have a coworker whose client is 17, so he's about to age out. Mm-hmm. And he was in a home for a year that said they were going to adopt him, and they disrupted, which means kick out, basically. They disrupted him a week before they were going to adopt him. Mm. So that left us scrambling to try and find somebody who wanted to adopt them. And then we found another home that said they would adopt him, and they kicked him out like a month before they were going to adopt him. So, and you see it, like, basically a lot of it depends on how old they are when they come into foster care.
Yeah.
If they're a teenager, the chances are really slim that someone's going to adopt them.
Yeah.
If they are going to get adopted, it's going to be from that foster home that's had them for a year and just fell in love with them, or decided that they didn't dislike them enough to kick them out, basically. Mm-hmm. So yeah, when a kid starts approaching that age out time, 16, 17, 18, that's when we start to see kids move around the most, unless they have severe behavioral issues, and then those kids get moved around. And they're the ones who need the love the most. Like, they have behavioral issues for a really good reason. Those kids get moved around all the time because foster parents just can't take it. It's really hard to care for children like that. So there is a lot of bouncing around, basically.
What percentage do you think of the foster children actually go into this adoption process or get returned back to their parents?
You know, I'm not sure. I don't think I've been working long enough to have a good idea about percentages. I'll say right now I have 14 kids. I would say probably about half of them will end up going back to their parents, maybe a little less than half. And then the rest will probably end up either bouncing around or hopefully getting adopted.
What do you think's the biggest misconception about foster care?
I don't know. Let me think about that. The biggest misconception, I guess, I don't know. So, like, within foster care, the foster parents that I have, they have a misconception from within the system.
Okay.
And then I suppose people out of the system might have a different misconception. So, within the system, I would say the biggest misconception is that the kids are not your kids.
Okay.
So, like, a lot of foster parents take the kids into their home intending to be very compassionate and everything, but then they treat the kids like they're outsiders the entire time they're in the home.
Okay.
Like, any responsibility that you would just feel like you had to take on if it were your children, like, oh, my child has a doctor's appointment today. Mm-hmm. They will expect us to take them to the doctor. And like I have a foster parent who had a death in the family, and it didn't even cross their mind to take their kids, the foster kids, with them to the funeral service. Like, she just called me and told me to find someone else to take them during that time, because those kids don't have a connection with that person who died, but really that person's a part of the only family they have right now. So they might even be interested to go to the funeral for that person, but it doesn't even cross this person's mind that they're part of the family. The biggest problem or misconception from outside the system is, like, I don't know. I think people have unrealistic expectations for how easy or hard it's going to be.
Okay.
So a lot of the foster parents come into it thinking, God told me to do this, so I'm going to do it. But then the kids end up thinking that they're a chore. They don't feel love for who they are. They feel, I have one kid who tells me all the time, my foster parents tell me that they're only keeping me here because God told them to. Well, I appreciate people wanting to do things because of their faith.
Right.
But these kids need to feel like they themselves are loved too. Like, not just that they're a piece of charity. So I guess it's kind of two sides of the same coin. Like, these kids need to feel like they are loved individually and uniquely for who they are. And I feel like that understanding is lacking from both sides.
Do you think that the foster parents are afraid to form an attachment to that child? That's why they treat them a little different? Or what do you think's behind that?
I think it depends. I do think there are some that have that feeling, as it's like a defense mechanism. Like, they're going to leave eventually anyway, so I'm going to push them away. Some of them just aren't prepared to handle how difficult the children are. Mm-hmm. Like, it's really easy to think that you'd be a great foster parent when you think of the orphan child being like Annie, like really cute and nice. But some of these kids have severe problems, like violence, sexual reactivity. Just sometimes they steal, sometimes they lie, sometimes they set fires. Like, so sometimes it's what you're talking about, like fear to create an attachment. And sometimes it's really these kids are hard to love sometimes.
Right. I've thought about it in the past, us becoming foster parents, but it would be very hard for us to have a child come into the house, be there for 2 weeks, and then they go back with their parents, say. Or, that it's an emotional roller coaster. Again, this is somebody from the outside looking in, not being a foster parent myself or being part of that system. Just looking in, it would look like it would be a constant roller coaster of emotions. With programs like yours, to where they're trained a little bit up front, I think it's a good start to that process. That's good to know that takes place. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, like, when I hear somebody saying that, like, oh, I would be heartbroken if they left, that's exactly the kind of person we're looking for. Mm-hmm. We're looking for the kind of person who would invest wholeheartedly, even at the risk that you might lose that kid, because, I mean, we want these kids to be loved as much as they can be. And I understand that feeling because I get a shadow of that from working with them. Like, sometimes they get moved to where I can't be their worker anymore. And sometimes I wish I could just take them home to my house and adopt them and foster them or whatever. But yes, we want the kind of people who would be heartbroken if they lost I don't want anyone to be sad, but at the same time, like, if you're heartbroken when that person leaves, that means that you cared about them and that you were investing in them. But the training is definitely an important part of helping with that. And then there's also a support network. We try to get all our foster parents to know each other and bond with each other and hopefully be a support for things like grief and things like that. So,
do you have any idea how many foster kids are in Tennessee? Any idea?
I don't know, but it would probably be pretty easy to find out by going onto DCS's website. Okay. Another good website is adoptuskids.org. That has a list of all of the kids who are in full state custody, which means that their parents' rights have been terminated. So everybody on that site, we're looking for pre-adoptive foster homes for them. So that's another way to go about fostering. You can be a general foster care person that just would take anyone, or you can go to adoptuskids.org and see if there's any specific children you're interested in adopting, and you can apply to be a foster parent just specifically for that child or children.
Okay.
And the process would be the same. You would have to go through the training to be a foster home and things like that. And then I believe our agency, and I think DCS does the same thing, but our agency would put them in the foster home for 6 months before you had the option to adopt them.
Okay.
So it's just like if you were adopting from overseas, usually you have at least a 6 months waiting period, usually even more, like a year. It's like that waiting period, except for the child is actually in your home with you. So you kind of get practice, but hopefully it's not a situation where you're like flippant and you're going to be like, oh, if it doesn't work out, we'll just kick you out.
Right. Hopefully
you have a good idea of whether you're willing to make that investment before you bring them into your home.
Was there more requirements for the pre instead of just being a foster parent?
It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same. The only thing you'd have to do is just make it clear that you didn't want to accept more placements if that was the case.
Okay.
So, yeah, the process is exactly the same.
What do you feel is the biggest problem with the foster care system?
The biggest problem, well, first of all, the biggest problem is we never have enough foster parents. The biggest problem institutionally would be just how many times things have to be redone because of switching placements. So like they're constantly having to get new doctor's appointments, dental appointments, psychological appointments. And the thing that really suffers the most is school. They're constantly missing school. They're constantly switching schools. And once they're in a school, they're often missing whole days of school because of therapy appointments or doctor's appointments. They're things that the kids need. But I mean, almost all of my clients are failing most of their classes because they just haven't had continuity of education at all.
Right. Do they usually stay in the same geographical location when they moved?
We try.
Okay.
We try. But for example, I have a child who was taken from his home in Athens, and he's staying in downtown Chattanooga.
Okay.
So that's over an hour away from where he was before, and it's just simply because of who we had available to take him.
Sure. Someone who's not a foster parent or is not willing to do that at this point, is there other ways that people could help the system?
Yes. Okay. So there are fundraisers all the time. So you can always help out monetarily. You can go to the private organizations' websites. Like my agency is called Camelot Care Centers. There's also Omnivisions. They do a foster care. Youth Villages does foster care. Centerstone does foster care. So you could look up any of those places and see about volunteering or donating. We're always at Camelot, for one, we're always looking for mentors. What mentors do is they help with transportation for things like if the foster parents can't take them to a doctor's appointment, but also sometimes they take kids out to like a ball game or something, just almost like a big brother, big sister sort of thing. And you would get paid for that if you did that. So we're always taking applications for mentors. Of course, you can do what I do. Another thing you can do is you can go through the foster parent training to be a respite home. Respite homes are homes that give foster families a break, basically. So you would go through the normal foster parent training, and then if a foster family was like, oh, I really need to go out of town to a work conference this weekend and I don't have anyone to take this child, well, they would call me and I would call you if you're a respite home, and you would say yes or no, I can take them for 2 days, And that's something that's really low commitment because you get the training, you have all these great skills that you learned, and you can say no if you don't want to do it. It's just you're on a list and we'll call you if we need help. So that's something that's really helpful. We're always looking for respite homes.
Okay.
And then if you find you love the work, you can transition into being a full foster home if you want to.
That's really interesting because I've never heard of any of those things, which is, I guess, another problem with the system. Most of just average citizens have no idea that this is going on because it's never discussed. I never hear anybody talking about it. And it's good that we get this opportunity to say, hey, this is something that these kids need, you know, and people can be a part of that somehow.
Yeah. And another thing to keep in mind is like all of the things besides donating that I mentioned offer monetary compensation.
Okay.
So being a foster home, you get paid to have those kids in your home. You get paid, and then you also get stipends for things like clothes. So if you're worried that you can't financially support another child in your home, that's not something you need to worry about because we do offer compensation for that. And most of the time you end up with a little bit of a profit. You usually aren't worried about, oh, they're eating so much, I can't pay for it. Well, we'll give you money for that. So,
right.
And the same for respite. If you had them at your house for a weekend, you get paid, depending on the level of the child and their needs, around $30 a day for respite, sometimes up to $40 or more, I think, just depending on the needs of the child.
Okay. We haven't really talked about adoption in depth very much. There seems to be this idea that adoption is very expensive. Is that true in the cases that you've seen, or is that just a misconception?
It's one of the most upsetting misconceptions. I've been talking with some friends about why they'd be more interested in foreign adoption as opposed to domestic adoption. And almost all of them heard that it's easier and cheaper to adopt foreign children, but that's absolutely not the case. If you adopt through the state, like through the website I told you about, adoptuskids.org, or through foster care, it costs you absolutely nothing to adopt. In fact, the state will... So if I can get a little personal here, My husband and I are in the process of possibly adopting a child from foster care. He is 17. He's about to age out. We would have to foster him for 6 months before we could adopt him. Those 6 months we'd be being paid like any normal foster care person. Because he's older than, I think, 12. I don't know what the cutoff is, but teenagers, basically, I think is the thing. It might be younger, but I think once they hit teenager time, maybe after 14, they pay you even after you adopt. So,
really?
Yeah, it's a little less, but the state assists you in keeping that child in your home, essentially. Okay. So this child, the 17-year-old child that my husband and I are thinking of adopting, we'd be paid, I think, about $35 a day while we were fostering him.
Okay.
And then $28 a day after we adopt him.
Okay.
The legal fees would all be covered by the state, and he would not lose his 10 care when he came into our home. So literally, I cannot think of a cheaper way to adopt if money is something that concerns people who want to adopt. It's not really an issue with domestic adoption if you adopt an actual needy child. If you're doing a private adoption, that's where the expense comes in.
Okay. Wow, that's unbelievable. Because all you hear is about how expensive adoption is.
Yeah, it's absolutely not expensive. It's only expensive if you are like trying to get a very specific type of baby.
Yeah. Like
a lot of people who want to adopt are like, well, I want a newborn.
Yeah.
Whose mother is definitely not on drugs, you know. Basically, they're wanting a surrogate carrier for a baby. Right. That is expensive. But if you're wanting to adopt because you have compassion on orphans, it shouldn't cost you anything to do until they're yours. If they're little and they're yours, and they cost whatever a normal child would cost.
Right.
So.
That is very good to know. Any positive, happy stories that you can tell from your experiences?
Oh, yes, definitely. I got to be present at an adoption. That's my favorite thing, when I get to be present at divestments, which is where they're just taken out of custody and put back into their family custody, and I get to be present at adoptions. So there's one really lovely family here in Cleveland, actually, who had 3 kids in their home. And they had them in their home for like 3 or 4 years or something like that. And these kids had some pretty severe behaviors. But every day I talked to their foster mother, the mother was just like, I just can't wait to get them adopted. They keep thinking we're going to kick them out, but we love them. We just want them to feel secure here. And I think the adoption's really going to do that. Wow. So finally, like, they were getting adopted over at the Bradley County Courthouse. They were all dressed up. They looked so cute and beautiful. And they just had such shining faces. And when the adoption happened, the whole room was like clapping, and the Bradley County Court gives special adoption day presents to the kids that get adopted.
Nice.
And they just took like 1,000 pictures afterward, just celebrating the birth of their new family. And they had been in that home for 3 or 4 years. And it wasn't until they got adopted that they truly felt relief, like, oh, we're a family now. So that was a really great time. And the same thing with, I had another client who was divested into his grandmother's care. And his grandmother, he was taken from his mother. And then his paternal grandmother didn't know until he had already been taken. Okay. And so she spent like a year trying to get him back. But because we had to make sure everybody was healthy, everybody was safe, and all that stuff, it took a long time. Just seeing her face when the court finally said, he's yours, he can go with you today. Like, that was such a wonderful, wonderful thing. So I love those moments. And then also just seeing when kids come into custody, it's so sad when they first come into custody because, like I said before, they're hoarding food. Yeah. Sometimes they're afraid of sudden noises or light. Usually I get to see wonderful progress in their health, in mental and physical health, from the time they come into custody through the next couple of months. So that's always something that makes me really happy, seeing these kids become healthier. Right.
That is absolutely wonderful. Well, Kelsey, thank you so much for being with us today. I hope that this will help someone make a decision to go into the foster care program or to at least be a mentor and just start the process of seeing what they can do to help some of these kids. Thank you so much for being here.
No problem. Thank you.
I certainly hope you enjoyed this episode of Kitchen Table Politics. Please give us a follow on Twitter at KTPOLS. That's KT Polls. And check out our website, ktpolitics.com. We'll see you next time.